Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Timothy Adon, composer and sound designer for video games, here with another episode of integrating Wwise into the Unreal Engine. Last time, we talked about getting switches to work, enabling reverb, putting together rooms, and how they function along with acoustic portals. In addition, I ended up mentioning the acoustic textures that appeared when I was setting that up, as well as spot reflectors and surface reflectors that at the time I had no idea how they functioned. And that is going to be the subject of today's video. It is important to note that in order to get any of these things to work, you have to have access to the Wwise Reflect plugin, which if you are paying for Wwise is a separate purchase that you need to make on Audiokinetic's website. I am running an evaluation copy for the game, which I also end up getting access to SoundSeed. Thank you, Audiokinetic and Mike, for helping me get that set up so that I can continue making these videos. So first things first, in order to get this set up, we're going to go ahead and go to Wwise. This is going to work very similarly to setting up reverb and other effects for the game that we did in the last video, which means creating separate auxiliary buses for the effects that we want to run. In this case, we're going to be running Wwise Reflect. So I have several more buses here than I had last time. You'll notice this is the reverb effect that we're generally using in our game, mostly because it's really easy to hear, so we know it's working. And I have 4 different buses that are running Reflect right now, most of them for testing purposes. Stadium Reflections is the one that I'm using for my game, but these other ones are great for testing and making sure that things are working properly. So you create the bus, you add the plugin, and this is what it's going to end up looking like. That's a good example of what I was doing to try to mix it, but let's look at this one instead. So this is what it's going to look like by default, except for the speed of sound. And so going from top to bottom as to what all of these mean, speed of sound is how long it's going to take for the sound to reach you based on game units per second. And if you remember, a game unit in Unreal is 1 centimeter. So in this case, this particular instance of the Wwise Reflect plugin is moving at 1,000 centimeters per second. Center percentage is how much of the sound gets routed to center speakers for the cases of 3D sound, in case there is a center speaker or any audio would get routed to that in the first place. Output should be pretty self-explanatory. That is how loud the sound will be, how much louder or quieter the sound will be when it reaches your speakers. And then there are all of these attenuation and filter bands. So there's 2 different versions of distance attenuation, and I'll describe the differences in a moment. There's low-pass filter, high-pass filter, and distance spread. And you'll notice that all of these, except for this variant of distance attenuation, are image source versus listener. This one is emitter versus listener. Now, if you haven't quite guessed, emitter is the original sound source. So if I were to fire a gun, the gun would be the emitter, while you would be the listener. The image source has to do with the various reflections. So when the sound is triggered and there is a surface that is going to reflect the sound, the surface is going to take a copy of the sound and then delay it by an amount of time based on the listener's distance from that reflector and the speed of the sound. It's basically a tap delay. You know, you fire the sound and then the delay will fire it back after X amount of time. So the attenuation is going to lower the volume of that sound based on your distance from the image source. And of course, I have max distance set to 30,000 centimeters. The emitter versus listener attenuation doesn't necessarily matter if you have distance attenuation already set up on the sound in question. So in this case, the rifle has a attenuation already set up on it, which means that I shouldn't need to have an attenuation on this, but there would be reasons that you might want that at some point in time. Hi there, quick little addendum to what I just said. There is a particular reason to have this, and that is that this will control the volume of the Reflect plugin based on your distance between you and the emitter. So in case you wanted to cut the volume from the plugin, if you are too close or too far away from the emitter, then that would be the reason that you would want to have this. As far as my game is concerned, it's not necessary. However, there are definitely uses for having this here. Now back to your regularly scheduled me. And then the low pass filter and high pass filter are there to try to make the sound a little bit more real. As sound travels through air, different frequencies will be attenuated at different intensities based on temperature of the air, humidity of the air, and the frequency of the sound. I looked into this a little bit and fell down the rabbit hole a little bit too far. I ended up having to stop because it was a lot. So once you have this set up, and trust me, you will spend a lot of time mixing this, as I have, and I will continue spending a lot of time mixing this appropriately so that it sounds good when I'm done. Then you can go ahead and start having this set up in Unreal. Just remember that you're going to want to throw these new auxiliary buses into your sound bank and generate. And of course, before I forget, one last thing that you are going to want to do is for the buses that contain the Reflect plugin, you will want to go to the Positioning tab and enable 2D positioning. You still want to make sure that the reflections appear are appropriately positioned as far as panning is concerned, but you don't need it to be 3D because the Reflect plugin is already creating a 3D image. So having the game also calculate it again in a 3D position doesn't make any sense. Unless you're looking for something like that, of course. Once you are done with that, you will want to go into Unreal and generate your sound banks so that you have access to those new auxiliary buses in your Wwise picker. And then you can throw them in your content browser and they are ready to attach to your various objects in the game. Now, the last couple things you'll need to do to have this appropriately set up is you need to attach these to the objects that are emitting sounds. So I have an external AK object sitting here that I can trigger remotely in order to trigger a rifle sound. And right now I have it set up to be routed through the slow Reflect plugin. And the reason it's called slow is so that it's really easy to hear the reflections when I trigger the sound. Now this does mean that you can only have each sound when it comes to this audio volumes, and I'll discuss spot reflectors in a little bit, but when it comes to audio volumes, you can only have one instance of early reflections at a time. And I didn't end up looking this up specifically, but I'm absolutely certain that you can change this in code so that if you move from one room to another room, you can have your audio objects change which auxiliary bus it's getting routed through, but I haven't actually tested that out myself yet. But that's very important to know. Each AK object can only get routed through one early reflections auxiliary bus at a time. And I'm sorry if you're hearing like vacuums in the background. My neighbors are doing a lot of cleaning at the moment. So let's go ahead and test this out. One quick note, I did discover a bug, and this bug also happens to be a feature. Every other time I enter the game in order to test things, none of the spatial audio stuff works. It's just, it all ends up turning off and it's all dry audio. And the reason I think that's a feature is because it means that if I wanted to test a sound without having any of the reverbs or early reflections turned on, it means that I don't have to go through and literally turn everything off. I can just hit play a couple times and it'll turn itself off anyways. So let's go ahead and go in. So just so you know, I can trigger the rifle remotely by hitting the minus key on my number pad. And you can hear it over there. And just so you know, this is a room with an acoustic portal. So any sounds in there will only bleed through the acoustic portal and won't trigger any spot reflectors that are nearby. And the blue lines here are the debug draw, so you can kind of see where the first order reflections are going to come from. And so if I trigger the remote rifle right now, you will hear all of the reflections. And that includes second order reflections and third order reflections as well. Obviously, if you fire a gun inside of a room, it's not going to sound like that. But I have this routed through the slow-moving reflections so that it's really easy to tell that it's actually working. But if I fire my rifle right now, and this is the rifle that my character is holding, you will notice a slight change in how it sounds and a little bit of phasing as well, based on my distance from the walls and where I am looking. Because the rifle is actually using the more realistic Reflect plugin right now, which is kind of interesting because that means that you can have multiple variants of, or different Reflect plugins being triggered by different sounds in the same room. Which could have some very fun ramifications if you wanted to play around with it for something. Now, on to spot reflectors. Before I talk about like some of the major differences, if you are in a room, any spot reflectors outside of the room will not trigger, but spot reflectors inside of the room will. And similarly, if you are outside of the room, any spot reflectors inside of the room will not trigger. So that does give you a little bit more control over how early reflections can work if you wanted to have that little extra bit of granularity. Now, another big difference about spot reflectors, and here, let me actually go outside here. You can hear the spot reflector on those mountains. But you'll notice that over here, the remote rifle that I have going is not triggering the spot reflector. Just to prove my point about that. So spot reflectors are an exception to the rule of having your sound only be routed through one auxiliary bus with Reflect on it. Because reflectors use their own auxiliary bus. So when you trigger a sound, the spot reflector will capture that sound and then route it through this auxiliary bus with its own acoustic textures, and I'll talk about that in a little bit as well, and then it'll shoot it back at you. The difference with the spot reflectors is that there won't be any second order or third order reflections. It is a single delayed sound that is going to be fired back at you. So having like multiple spot reflectors right next to each other won't have them talking to each other and firing off a sound infinitely. No, it will simply fire the sound to all the listeners once. But it does give you extra control over how the sound just propagates the area if you wanted to. And especially in the case of mountains, where if you're close enough, you can have it so that the spot reflector doesn't trigger at all, or rather the volume is muted. But then as you get further away, you can start hearing the reflection of the mountain. Using the high pass and low pass filters, you can make the sound very realistic based on the distance to the mountain. Similarly, in the case of Players Unknown Battlegrounds, is actually a really good example. I don't actually know if they use Wwise, but it's still a very good example of how things should sound based on distance from an emitter and distance from a spot reflector or from a mountain. So you'll notice I'm triggering the rifle, the remote rifle, but I am actually too far away to hear the remote rifle itself. So what I'm hearing is the reflection coming off of the spot reflector. Because the other rifle that I'm firing is like right over there. And so if I were to get closer, and the numbers I have in the corner is my distance from the spot reflector and my distance from the remote rifle. And now you can hear the other rifle. So it gives you a lot of playing room in order to determine how you want things to sound in your game based on the emitter as well as any various spot reflectors in mountains and forests and other buildings. And honestly, I just think that is super cool. So a few other tests, and I have another testing room for this. Over here, I have a room that is also a reverb that also has surface reflectors going. And inside of that room, I have my remote rifle, as well as a spot reflector with the medium speed reflect in it, and a spot reflector with a slow speed reflect in it. And over here, I have a volume that is just reverb, no rooms, no surface reflectors, with another copy of the 2 spot reflectors using the slow and medium speed reflect plugins. So here's the remote rifle. I don't know why, but the remote rifle will trigger that one, but it won't trigger that one. And that is very weird to me. But if I fire my own rifle, you will also notice that 345 centimeters a second is really slow. Something else you'll have noticed is that these sounds all triggered the reverb, and that's not necessarily always the case. In order to have that work, you actually have to set it up as if they were audio objects within Wwise themselves. So if you notice, like with the footsteps, that it uses game-defined auxiliary sends. Well, you can do the same thing with the auxiliary buses using game-defined auxiliary sends. And I had these turned off originally, and that would mean that the initial gunshot would have reverb attached to it, but the reflections would not. It was kind of disconcerting, actually. So that's an important thing to remember for that. Now, moving on to the other area, if I take... Where's my player start? There it is. Move me over to here. And so that is a good test of the idea that since this is not a room, these spot reflectors, even though they are outside of the volume, will still trigger for any sounds that occur within the volume. And on top of that, they will still be affected by the reverb, even though the spot reflectors are outside of it. And that's because the sound is, even though I guess technically the sound is being triggered outside of the volume, the sound's not actually playing until it's inside the volume. So that's the extent of the actual testing that I've done. I have not tried doing things like putting other effects on these to see if they trigger, mostly because I was just so busy playing around with Reflect. So I haven't gotten that far. I haven't decided to create large effect chains for spot reflectors and surface reflectors. But I did delve into what would be the basic uses of these. So now if we go into the main game that I am putting together, if you're paying attention, you will notice that there is a lot that is different. So I now have several of these spatial audio volumes set up around my map. And you'll even notice that I have an interior volume, and then an exterior volume, and then another interior volume and exterior volume. And this is so that the sound propagates appropriately for the walls. If I only had this interior volume without this one being here, the sound might not actually reflect. If I'm out in this outer area, the sound might not actually reflect off of these walls appropriately. And so I have these inner and outer volumes so that the sound will reflect regardless of where I am on the map. And on top of that, you will notice that instead of just numbers, the surfaces now have names on them. And that is for the acoustic textures, which I have not talked about yet. So acoustic textures, you'll notice that each of these surfaces has a number on it. It goes 0, 1, 2, and 3 for the 4 walls, and then 4 being the upper part, and 5 being the lower part. In fact, 4 should actually be disabled, and 5 should be the concrete. There we go. That's better. And what an acoustic texture does is it will attenuate the sound by frequency band, 4 different frequency bands, by a certain percentage before it then reflects the sound back to the listener. And you can also, handily enough, attach acoustic textures to spot reflectors as well. And these are very easily created. They are share sets under Virtual Acoustics. And if you look at these, it is very simple. It is simply a low band, mid-low, mid-high, and high. They are pre-default set to specific frequencies, which I don't remember right now, but you can change that in code in the Wwise API, I think, if I remember reading that correctly. And basically what this is it will absorb a certain percentage of that frequency band, and then it will send the rest back to the listener when it gets reflected. So in this case, I've got my concrete walls. I've got large outer walls, which I kind of have set up to kind of be like metallic walls. And then I have people. Because, the outside of this is supposed to be a large stadium. At least that's the idea. So you'll notice I also have a large area that is one big volume that is also a surface, that also has surface reflectors turned on. And I realized, I was wondering why it wasn't sounding good. There isn't a reverb attached to starting room right now, so we're going to put in forest room instead. And so if we go into the game now, actually, you know what? I don't like that reverb. Let's get rid of that. It also makes it hard to hear the early reflections. There we go. So this is the laser gun bouncing off of the concrete walls. And then if we go out here, you can't hear it very well, and that's pretty realistic because of the distance of these walls. I might actually put them a little closer. But you can hear the reflection. Oh my God, get away from me. You can hear the reflection off of this wall. And if you pay really close attention, you can just barely hear the reflections coming off of the other walls. Oh crap, I died. Okay, so if you saw those debug draw lines, I have a copy of my fire other rifle object over here. And that was to be, oh God. And that was meant to be a test, because you can just hear the reflection from that other wall. Now that's what I've got for today. Things that I plan on doing at the beginning of at the start of each level here, I kind of want to have an announcer, basically announcing what's going on. And I want to have that sound originate up here. Ignore the box, that's for lighting and stuff. Originate up here. And I'm very curious to hear how that is going to sound when it is reflected off of all of these walls, as well as the concrete walls down there, with an eventual reverb also attached to it. And I'm very excited to kind of hear how that sounds. And I might even, on top of having it originate from there, I might also have what will essentially be little speakers attached to the inside and outside walls here, so that the player can always hear, no matter where they are, what the announcer is saying through little speakers in the side here. And that has me pretty excited. Something else that I want to try out is SoundSeed plugin, which is supposed to, if I remember the description correctly, supposed to help with varying repetitive sounds. So like, if I'm firing a gunshot over and over and over again, it's supposed to help with the randomization of how it sounds every time you fire it. But I haven't actually looked at all into that because I've been looking exclusively at Reflect at the moment. But now that I am essentially done with Reflect, I can go ahead and move on to SoundSeed. Something else that I want to do is I want to start adding in music, as well as talk about how you can get different segments of music to play together based on certain parameters occurring in the game. But that is going to take me a little bit of extra time. For now, that is all I have for this video. If you have any questions about anything that I did today, or have any questions that you would like me to address in the future, then absolutely feel free to comment on this video or find me on Twitter. I am @TimothyAdon on Twitter. And if you like this video, please hit the like button or subscribe or do any of those things. And I also have a Ko-fi account, and I will always appreciate coffee. If you are up for getting me some, I need that elixir. For now, that is all. I hope you have yourselves a wonderful day. I hope you found this video informative. If there was anything that I didn't address appropriately, please let me know. That will greatly help the quality of my videos in the future. And yeah, so I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you again in the future. Bye-bye!